The mist clung to the surface of the Silver Vein River like a shroud, smelling of damp earth and the metallic tang of impending tragedy. It was at the bleeding edge of dawn when the elite trackers of the Obsidian Peak Pack finally closed the distance. They didn't find a monster. They found a girl. Elara Vance sat motionless in the crimson-stained silt of the riverbank. She was small, her frame delicate even for an Omega. Her simple gray tunic shredded and soaked through with a mixture of river water and a darker, thicker crimson. She was cradling something to her chest, a small, broken bundle of fur that twitched with the rhythmic, agonizing pulse of a fading life. Around her, the circle of warriors tightened. These were the Iron Guard, the most ruthless killers in the northern reaches, their eyes glowing with the predatory hunger of the hunt. They expected a fight, or perhaps a plea for mercy. Elara gave them neither. Her gaze, those wide, soulful eyes that usually compelled alphas to offer protection, remained fixed on the golden fur of the pup in her arms. "Step away from the prince, Omega." The voice didn't just carry through the air. It vibrated through the marrow of her bones. It was a command laced with the ancient power of the Alpha Prime. Through the parting mist stepped Kaelen Shadow-Walker. He was a titan of a man, standing 7 feet of scarred muscle and terrifying grace. His fur, a shimmering abyss of midnight black tipped with silver, seemed to ripple beneath his skin as his wolf pushed against the surface. In his hand he gripped the Starseer spear, a weapon forged from meteorite iron and quenched in the blood of 100 usurpers. Its tip was leveled directly at Elara's throat. "He is dying," Elara whispered. Her voice was thin, like parchment tearing, but it held a terrifying clarity. "You dare speak?" snarled Soren, Kaelen's lead enforcer. In stepping forward with claws extended, "You were found with the king's nephew. You were found over the body of the heir to the Obsidian throne. You have murdered the lineage of the Shadow-Walker." "No," Elara breathed, finally lifting her head. The warriors flinched. They expected the cunning glint of a traitor. Instead, they saw a face mapped with pure, unadulterated grief. Tears tracked lines through the mud on her cheeks, clear and bright. "The Sky Ravens," she said, her voice trembling. "They were still feeding when I found him. I drove them off, but their talons, the venom is deep." She shifted her arms slightly, revealing the pup's torso. The sight made the hardened warriors gasp. Deep, jagged furrows had been carved into the young wolf's chest, the unmistakable mark of the giant raptors that haunted the high peaks. The pup, Leo, couldn't have been more than 7 winters old. His breathing was a wet, shallow rattle. "Lies!" Soren barked, though his scent spiked with a sudden, jagged uncertainty. "Omegas are weak. You couldn't drive off a single sky raven, let alone a flock." "Look at my hands," Elara commanded. It wasn't a plea, it was a testament. She held up a palm. The flesh was shredded, the skin hanging in ribbons where she had literally caught the talons of the great birds to keep them from the boy's throat. Her forearms were a map of defensive wounds. "I have carried him for 6 miles, she said, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "I ran toward your borders. I ran toward the spears. If I wanted him dead, I would have left him in the tall grass for the scavengers. But he was crying. He was so small. And he was calling for his uncle." Kaelen's golden eyes narrowed, the spear tip dipping a fraction of an inch. He looked at the girl, this packless, unclaimed wanderer who lived in the gray zones between territories. She had no protection, no status, and no reason to risk her life for a royal house that viewed her kind as little more than background noise. "Why?" Kaelen demanded, his voice a low thrum of thunder. "Why risk the wrath of a king for a child not of your blood?" Elara looked him directly in the eye, ignoring the lethality of the spear. "Because he was afraid, and no one should have to cross the veil feeling like they aren't loved." The silence that followed was heavier than the mist. The warriors of Obsidian Peak knew the truth of the sky raven venom. It was a necrotic toxin. Once it hit the heart, there was no cure, not even for a royal. Leo's eyes fluttered open, the clouded blue of a winter sky. His small, human-like hand reached up, clutching feebly at Elara's tattered collar. Is Uncle Kael here?" the boy whimpered in the old tongue, the primal language of the first wolves. "He is here, little son," Elara replied in the same ancient, melodic dialect. Her fluency was startling, a remnant of a lineage she never spoke of. "I'm cold," Leo whispered. "Am I going to the Great Forest?" "The Great Forest is warm, Leo," Elara murmured, pressing her forehead against his. "The sun never sets there, and the rivers run with honey. Your mother is waiting at the edge of the woods. Will you come?" Elara's heart shattered audibly in the silence of the clearing. "I will stay until you reach the gate. I promise. I won't let go." What happened next would be etched into the history of the northern reaches. Elara Vance, the girl with no name and no pack, began to hum. It wasn't just a melody, it was the Omega's requiem, a soul song so ancient it predated the first walls of the first city. It was the sound of a mother's heartbeat, of the wind through the pines, of safety. The Iron Guard, men who had decapitated enemies without blinking, felt their wolves whine in their chests. They watched as the Alpha King, the man who had never shown weakness, slowly lowered his spear until the point buried itself in the mud. Elara leaned down and kissed Leo's brow. As she sang, the tension left the pup's body. The frantic, terrified beating of his heart slowed, synchronizing with the rhythm of her voice. He wasn't dying in a puddle of mud anymore. In his mind, he was being sung to sleep in a bed of down. "Go on, little wolf," she whispered into his ear. "Run ahead. We'll catch up." Leo took one long, shuddering breath, a small smile touching his lips, and then his soul slipped away into the quiet of the morning. The howl that tore from Elara's throat wasn't the sound of an Omega. It was the primal scream of the earth itself. She clutched the boy's cooling body to her chest, rocking back and forth, her grief so massive it seemed to warp the very air. One by one, the warriors of the Obsidian Peak dropped to their knees. Kaelen Shadow-Walker was the first. He let his weapon fall, a king's ultimate surrender, and knelt in the blood-soaked mud beside the girl who had given his nephew the only thing he couldn't provide: a peaceful end. "Give him to me," Kaelen said after a long time. His voice was no longer a king's command. It was a plea. Elara looked up, her eyes vacant and red-rimmed. She hesitated, her arms tightening around the boy, before slowly, reverently, transferring the weight to Kaelen. The king held the boy with a tenderness that seemed impossible for hands so accustomed to violence. "I tried," Elara choked out, her strength finally failing. "I'm so sorry, I wasn't fast enough." "You did more than the gods themselves," Kaelen said, his golden eyes burning with a new, terrifying light. He looked at his men. "Soren, bring the litter. We return to the citadel." "And the Omega, sire?" Soren asked, his voice thick with respect. "She is not the Omega," Kaelen growled, standing up with his nephew in his arms. "She is the savior of the royal spirit. She comes with us. She sits at my right hand. If any man, woman, or council member dares to question her presence, they will answer to my teeth." The journey back to the citadel was a silent procession of ghosts. When they passed through the massive iron gates of the city, the bells began to toll, the slow, heavy ring of a royal passing. Thousands of wolves lined the streets, expecting to see their king returning with a prisoner. Instead, they saw a king walking side by side with a blood-stained girl, his hand resting firmly on her shoulder to steady her. At the steps of the great hall, Princess Lyra, Leo's mother, was already waiting. Her scream of agony when she saw the small shroud in Kaelen's arms nearly brought the city to its knees. But as Lyra collapsed, it wasn't her brother she reached for. It was the girl. "You were there," Lyra sobbed, clutching Alara's hands. "I felt it through the bond. Someone was holding him. Someone was singing. It was you." "I loved him as best I could in the time we had," Elara whispered. In that moment, the hierarchy of the pack, the rigid, cruel structure of Alpha and Omega, simply dissolved. Two women, bound by the death of a child, stood as equals on the steps of power. Months passed, but the shadows of that morning never truly left the Citadel. However, they changed. They became softer. Elara stayed. Yet at first it was out of necessity. She had no home, and the princess refused to let her leave. But soon, the reason changed. The pack began to notice that when Elara walked through the infirmary, the wounded healed faster. When she sat in the gardens, the pups played more fiercely. She was the heart they hadn't known they were missing. Kaelen, too, was changed. The Ice King had thawed. He spent his evenings not in the war room, but in the gardens with Elara, learning the words to the songs he had forgotten. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, Kaelen found her by the memorial statue they had raised for Leo. "The council is demanding I take a mate," Kaelen said abruptly. Elara stiffened, her heart dropping. "I see. A high-born alpha from the south, I imagine?" "No," Kaelen said, stepping into her space. He took her scarred hands in his. "I told them I had already found the only woman brave enough to lead this pack. I told them I found a woman who fought sky ravens with her bare hands and sang to the dying when the world turned cold." Elara looked up at him, breathless. "Kaelen, I am a packless Omega. The laws—" "I am the law," he whispered, leaning down until their breaths mingled. "And I am asking you, Elara Vance, not as a king, but as a man who was lost in the dark until he heard you sing. Stay with me. Rule with me. For let's build a kingdom where no one has to die alone." Elara looked at the statue of the little wolf, then back at the king who had dropped his spear. She didn't need a bond to know the answer. "I'll stay," she whispered, "as long as you never stop listening to the music." The vow was sealed not with a crown, but with a breath. Kaelen pulled her into the shadow of his massive frame, his forehead resting against hers. For a moment, the Alpha King of the most brutal territory in the Northern Hemisphere was nothing more than a man anchored by the steady heartbeat of the woman the world had called worthless. "There is something you must know before the council convenes," Elara whispered, her hands trembling in his. "I didn't just happen to know the Requiem, Kaelen. Omegas in the borderlands don't speak the old tongue. We are taught to forget it, to be silent, to be invisible." Kaelen stepped back, his golden eyes searching hers. "I suspected. Your scent, it stayed muted, like a fire banked by heavy ash. Even now, with my mark beginning to stir in your blood, you smell of nothing but rain and cedar." Elara pulled back the collar of her tunic. There, etched into the pale skin of her collarbone, was a faint, silvery scar in the shape of a broken lyre. Kaelen's breath hitched. He knew that mark. It was the sigil of the Heralds of Heir, a bloodline thought extinguished during the Great Purge a century ago. They weren't just Omegas. They were the Soulbinders, the only wolves capable of calming a feral alpha or easing a spirit into the great forest. "My grandmother hid me," she said. "She told me that if the kings ever found out a herald still lived, they would chain me to a throne and use my voice as a weapon of war. I ran from that fate my whole life, until I saw Leo." Kaelen's jaw tightened. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his life building walls of iron and bone to protect his people. Yet the most powerful weapon in his kingdom was this slip of a girl who had spent her life hiding from men exactly like him. "I will not chain you, Elara," he promised, his voice a low, vibrating growl of protectiveness. "But the council, they will see the sigil. They will try to claim you belong to the state, not the king." "Then let them try," Elara said, a spark of the fire that had fought the sky ravens lighting her eyes. "I am done hiding." The great hall was a cathedral of stone and ancient prejudice. 6 high alphas sat at the obsidian table, their faces etched with the skepticism of men who measured worth in kill counts and territory. At the head of the table sat Kaelen, but beside him, in a chair carved of white oak, sat Elara. "This is a mockery of our traditions, Shadow-Walker," spat Alpha Varick, a man whose neck was more scar tissue than flesh. "You bring a packless stray to the high table, to the seat of the Luna? It is an insult to the blood Nikolai spilled." Kaelen didn't move. He didn't need to. The air in the room grew heavy, the gravity increasing as his alpha aura expanded, pressing the elders into their seats. "The blood Nikolai spilled was honored by this woman, while you sat in your villas drinking wine. She gave him the passage of a hero. What have you given this kingdom lately, Varick, besides complaints?" "She is an Omega," Varick roared, slamming a fist onto the stone. "By law, she is property of the pack she resides in. If you want her in your bed, fine, but she has no voice here." Elara stood up. She didn't wait for permission. She walked to the center of the hall, the soft click of her boots echoing. Slowly, she reached up and unfastened the high collar of her dress, bearing the silver lyre for all to see. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. 2 of the elders stood so quickly their chairs clattered to the floor. "A herald," whispered the oldest among them, a blind seer named Mormont. "The song gift, it has returned." "I am Elara of the House of Vance," she said, her voice projecting with a resonance that made the tapestries shiver. "I am the last of the heralds. I held your prince as he passed, and I heard the ancestors welcome him. I do not sit at this table because the king invites me. I sit here because the earth and the moon demanded I return to lead the spirits of this pack." She turned her gaze to Varick. "You speak of property? Try to claim me, Alpha. See if your wolf can withstand the silence of a herald." Varick paled. The legend said a herald could strip a wolf of its voice, leaving the human trapped in a silent, powerless shell. He sat down, his bravado crumbling into a wary, begrudging respect. The ceremony took place at the summit of the obsidian peak, beneath the full lunar eclipse. It was a sight the Northern Territories would never forget. Kaelen stood in his ceremonial armor, the Starseer spear held upright. But it was Elara who held the crowd's breath. She wore a gown of gossamer silk, the color of moonlight. Her hair braided with the wildflowers that grew where Leo had been laid to rest. Princess Lyra stepped forward, carrying the dual crowns. She looked at Elara, and her eyes shining with a sister's love. "For my son," Lyra whispered, "and for our future." As the moon turned blood red, Kaelen took the crown of gold and placed it upon Alara's head. "I claim you," Kaelen's voice boomed across the mountains, amplified by the power of the bond. "Not as a subject, not as a prize. I claim you as my equal, my queen, my soul binder." Elara took the crown of silver and placed it on Kaelen's brow. "I claim you," she replied, her voice sweet as honey but strong as steel. "Not as a master, not as a king. I claim you as my partner, my shield, my heart." The pack let out a collective howl that shook the stars. It wasn't the howl of war, but a song of unity. The Alpha King and the Omega Queen had bridged the divide. Life in the Citadel transformed. The Omega quarters, once little more than glorified barracks, were torn down and replaced with the Hall of Healing, where Elara taught the forgotten songs of recovery. The rigid castes began to soften. Alphas began to realize that strength wasn't just about dominance, and Omegas realized their voices carried the weight of the heavens. Kaelen and Elara were inseparable. They spent their days reforming the laws, and their nights in the quiet of the royal gardens, often sitting by the small pond Leo had loved. One evening, Kaelen watched as Elara hummed to a group of young pups, her voice weaving a shimmering net of peace around them, and he felt the bond between them, a golden thread that pulsed with every breath she took. "You're thinking about that day again," Elara said, sensing his mood as she walked toward him. "I'm thinking about how close I came to killing you," Kaelen admitted, pulling her into his lap. "I had my spear at your throat. I saw a threat where there was only grace." "You saw a man who had lost too much," she corrected, kissing his jaw. "And I saw a king who was brave enough to drop his weapon." Kaelen smiled, still leaning his head back against the stone. "We have a long way to go, Elara. The southern packs are whispering of rebellion. They don't like our new laws. They think we've grown soft." Alara's eyes flashed with that ancient herald power. "Let them come. They'll find out that a pack that loves its king is 1,000 times more dangerous than a pack that fears him." Kaelen laughed, a deep, rich sound that had become common in the palace. "My queen of thorns and songs. Yeah, what would I do without you?" "You'd probably be growling at a wall somewhere," she teased. As the stars came out, reflecting in the still waters of the pond, the music began again, not from Alara's throat this time, but from the hearts of the people below in the city. A song of home, a song of safety. And in the center of it all, the Alpha and his herald watched the moon rise, yes, knowing that the story of the Omega who saved a prince was only the first chapter of the legend they would write together.